When individuals all across America and around the world saw people being beaten, being beaten down by fire hoses, chased by police dogs, seeing young children being dragged through the streets, they couldn't take it. There was a sense of righteous indignation on the part of so many Americans. People couldn't believe what was happening.
I initially was motivated to get involved in the civil rights movement by a pure coincidence. I was walking home from the office in downtown Providence in the spring of 1965 and saw this New York Times article about a small 5-year-old black child who was at a civil rights demonstration in Jackson, Mississippi with his mother, and a Mississippi Highway patrolman was behind him in the picture and grabbing an American flag from him, and the article related that he was thrown in a paddy wagon and taken to the state fairgrounds. I got so ticked off about how unfair that was and unjust that I began to look, and I also knew that there were very few black lawyers in the Deep South. I began to look for ways to get involved to go help people like that kid, and eventually was connected to the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, which took volunteers. Hinckley Allen generously let me spend a month in the summer of '65, and I became totally fulfilled with the work we were doing and the impact it was having. And so I came back for 2 years, and that's how it happened.
People like Mac and people like myself and folks young like us, we got engaged, we got involved, and it wasn't. I wasn't frightened, and I can't speak for Mac. Because I think that we were concerned, but I think the idealism that we had and our reason for being at a time like this, that we just couldn't stand aside while these inequities and injustices and just a yearn to make things better, to give people hope and to make sure people are treated fairly. That was a driving force. I mean, it was unconscionable to think about how human beings could treat other human beings because of the color of their skin.
Let me take this opportunity to thank these two wonderful souls for all that you did to help liberate America, to help usher in a new day, a new spirit. I know it was not easy for you to leave your families and spend time working in the vineyard. But you have made a major contribution. And when historians pick up their pens and write about the 60s, they will have to write that an unbelievable group of individuals, and the two of you represent the very best. So thank you for all you did and for all you will continue to do to make America and our world a better place.
I went down, I was with 4 students from Cornell, 4 white guys. So we met, we drove down, we headed to Atlanta. And we stopped at a Howard Johnson's on the highway to get something to eat in North Carolina. And that's when I came in contact with my first confrontation with the owner of the Howard Johnson restaurant, and said, we don't serve niggers in this restaurant. And the Cornell guys I was like upset. And I was, 6'3", and 2 of these guys were football players, and they were like, they were outraged. And I said, no, let's not. If we didn't leave, we were going to be arrested. And then we would never have made it down to Atlanta. So I convinced the guys, hey, look, you guys, our objective is to get to Atlanta. Let's leave. experience, a rich experience, but let's get to Atlanta. But that was my first direct confrontation, and it hurt. It was like, but it made all of what I'm thinking about come to life for me. My life wasn't threatened, but my personhood was. And I was like, oh my God. Then I started thinking about the millions of black Americans that had to endure that kind of indignity on a daily basis, but also with having their lives threatened without being given educational opportunities, and then on and on and on.
Be sitting in at a lunch counter in a restaurant, and someone would come up and spit on you, or put a lighted cigarette out of your hair, pour hot water, hot coffee on you. You're thrown in jail. Your disorderly conduct. And you're so orderly. You're so peaceful. So many people, hundreds and thousands, millions of Americans was deeply moved. They had to stand up. They had to speak up. They had to speak out. They had to find a way to do something about it, and they did it.
The first trial that I had in my legal career on my own took place the morning after my arrival in Mississippi. And like a lot of other things, there were very few of us with a lot of work, so you were thrown into situations often far beyond your legal experience. I was asked to, or told to go to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner had been assassinated several months before, and to defend a core worker, a young woman, on charge of carrying a concealed weapon, which was allegedly a shotgun in the back window of her car, like every other motor vehicle in Mississippi. So I looked up the statute, because I learned to do that at Harvard Law School, and it covered basically shotguns of fewer inch barrel, so sawed-off shotguns. Went to Philadelphia, and in Mississippi in those days, a justice of the peace didn't have to have any educational level. The so-called trial was in a garage, and the prosecuting officer was Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff, who subsequently would be convicted of having killed Cheney, been involved in killing Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, or actually convicted of violating their civil rights, to wit, murdering them. So he had the shotgun. I handed him the tape measure, asked him to measure the barrel. He asked him how many inches it was, read the statute, and said to the Justice of the Peace, "So, Your Honor, I move that the charges be dismissed because clearly this shotgun isn't covered by the statute." And Price just pointed the shotgun at my head and said, "Boy, either she's guilty or you're dead." And the Justice of the Peace said, "Guilty is charged," and set a fine. So that was my first trial.
America reacted. The members of Congress reacted. The President of the United States, President Kennedy, President Johnson, were all moved, saying to members of the Congress that represented these places, you got to do something. If not, the government, the federal government, would do something.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
One of the great lessons of my experience was to live and work firsthand with local blacks who consistently exhibited amazing leadership, courage, perseverance, a belief in America and its Constitution and constitutional rights, even though they had been deprived of employment, a decent education, property, family members, and often thrown in jail for unjust reasons over and over again. They still kept coming back for more, and I learned firsthand and owe them the lesson that every single human being has the capacity for greatness if they're just given the opportunity to achieve it.
We had a sort of a spirit that kept us together. We became a circle of trust, a band of brothers and sisters. We became a family. And from time to time, you would be beaten, you'd be thrown in jail, and you get out, and you come together, you would sing songs, you would pray, or go to some little club and listen to some good music, and then you go back to the battlefield to do your work.
It was a mission, and it was inspirational. And one of the reasons that, Dr. King was incredibly inspirational. The whole idea of the power of nonviolence against overwhelming force was totally inspirational. And I think in many ways, almost everyone who went there as part of the movement and spent any real significant time found it to be an absolute life-changing experience.
As volunteers, as a group of people committed to the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence, we made a determined effort to never, never, ever get lost in a sea of despair or to become bitter or hostile, that we would keep the faith, that we would be consistent and we would be persistent.
From a selfish perspective, I got a huge return and fulfillment from what I was doing there, and I realized that I liked doing it. People like all sorts of additional kinds of activities, hobbies or whatever, and in my case it just happened to be this really turned me on, which led to politics and certain things that occurred there. When I returned to Providence after a while and an opportunity to run for political office occurred, I took it and ended up on the Providence City Council. And in the 1980s, one of the issues was discrimination against people on account of their sexual orientation. And to me, that was just another example of the same kind of discrimination on account of people's color. And so I introduced legislation. We had a long battle to try to eliminate that, and it failed on a tied vote, but I think in the end contributed to the State General Assembly adopting that kind of legislation. Other examples that occurred were an effort to cause the city to disinvest in companies that doing business in South Africa during apartheid, and working to ensure that redistricting plans did not reduce minority group representation on the city council.
In politics, it's about really trusting a person and his motives. And Mac's motives were never questioned. They were always high. He was in politics for the right reasons. He was a selfless servant of the public.
About 15 years ago, the opportunity to get involved in Family Service of Rhode Island arose, and what appealed to me about what Family Service was doing at that time was that consistently they were helping people who had severe needs, whether mental health, victims of violence, abused and neglected children. There were categories that weren't racial or basically based on sexual orientation. They cut across everything, but in every instance, people without fault of their own were in severe need of help. And what I felt Family Service was doing was through very innovative and creative ways, and through partnerships with other agencies and government and business, was finding ways to model programs to help those, particularly kids, but children and families, to better futures, to solving these kind of elements of their lives which were just defeating any sort of opportunity for them.
So my one concern in going to Mac to approach him to be on the board of Family Service was that he would be so busy. He was at a huge key member and key partner in a huge law firm, active politically, active in the community. It was, I thought he would be stretched thin. But I really needed him because we were in a unique situation with the Family Service at the time. And much to my surprise, but much to my delight, he said yes. And unhesitatingly said yes once I laid out the challenges that we faced. And he came on board and not only served family service well, but I think took it to another level as he became more engaged and ultimately a leader on the board, or the leader on the board.
It's relatively simple in terms of what is, when we go to sleep forever, it's relatively simple, at least for guys, I think, like Mac and for me, just knowing at least we tried. We tried to help people, we tried to help our society, we tried to help our communities. And because we would be okay. Mac would be fine. We could survive. We could do things. But that wouldn't be a satisfied life. And a life of satisfaction really gets to how much we can improve our community, and how much we can improve the lives of people heretofore who've been deprived of equal opportunity.
I would say under the rule of law, the young lawyers, the students, the doctors and nurses and others that came helped usher in what I call a nonviolent revolution. A revolution of values, a revolution of ideas. They helped paint a picture to make it plain and clear to what was happening in the Deep South. And our country is a much better country, and we are a much better people because of the sacrifice and the unbelievable courage, what I call raw courage, on the part of people like Mike Farmer and others.